I'll precede my talk with a health warning. Our originally invited speaker on the 19th century unfortunately had to withdraw. So rather than leaving a gap in the programme, I decided to fill the breach with this paper. As will swiftly become clear, however, I'm not an expert in art history, the Victorian period, or the temperance movement, although I have become very interested in Cruikshank and his work in the course of my London research for the Intoxicating Spaces project, and I hope you enjoy this deep dive into his world. Also, a content warning, this paper does contain images and descriptions of addiction and suicide. So firstly, some background. Born in London's Bloomsbury in 1792, George Cruikshank was a highly prolific independent graphic artist who published over 6,000 designs over the course of his long career, for magazines, pamphlets, printed ephemera, and for books, most famously for Charles Dickens. He depended for his livelihood on commercial popularity, and his was a portfolio freelance career characterized by simultaneous piecework for different publishers and employers. He was, as Cynthia put it yesterday, a gun for hire. And as with other 19th century creators, his was a dialogic and distributed process of production, which borrowed ideas from amateurs, other artists, designers, and printers. There was a collaborative effort behind this kind of visual wit. Cruikshank specialised in variations of caricature and graphic satire, drawing on visual traditions going back to Bosch and Bruegel, the vivid pictorialism of the Bible and Aesop's fables, the work of his predecessor William Hogarth, who we heard about in Cynthia's talk yesterday, and the productions of his more celebrated contemporaries Thomas Rowlandson and James Gillray. This was a complex genre that had by the 19th century accumulated a huge corpus of traditional motifs and subjects, and artists were expected not to develop a wholly new idea, but rather to riff on previously established visual concepts. So it's almost a 19th century meme culture, if you like. Cruikshank's hallmark was rich and complex humorous compositions, inspired by the sights and smells of the London streetscapes he knew so well, very much in the manner of the 20th century Manchester cartoonists discussed by Peter yesterday. They are detailed, immersive, crowded, teeming with vibrant life, and possess, as I hope you'll see, an immediate delight and appeal. Now, Cruikshank deployed a variety of subtly different visual styles depending on the house styles of the various publishers for which he was working at any point in time, but they're all characterized by what art historian Richard Vogler has termed a nervous, vibrant style of sketchy line. They have a chaotic, almost surreal energy. So linking in with Steve's paper yesterday, Cruikshank also made very extensive use of visual narrative to create compelling and emotionally resonant stories, and was a great exponent of the Hogarthian progress, comprising elements such as explication, rising action, conflict, foreshadowing, climax, falling action, and denouement across a series of linked etchings. So that's a sort of Cruikshank 101. And he's particularly interesting for our purposes because intoxicants, especially alcohol, played a very large part in his contemporary reputation, possibly fueled by the 36 aquatint illustrations he and his brother prepared for Pierce Egan's bibulous memoir Life in London in 1821, one of which you can see here. And this was Cruikshank's first major work. Cruikshank's father and brother both overindulged in alcohol. The former collapsed comatose after winning a drinking contest in 1811 and never recovered. And whether Cruikshank himself was an alcoholic is unclear, but his documented tendency towards conviviality, company keeping, and sociability clearly disposed him towards what we would now recognize as habitual and excessive, if not wholly pathological, drinking for the first part of his adult life. And while later historians have resisted caricatures of Cruikshank as a lamppost climbing, gutter wallowing alcoholic before his conversion to temperance, his embrace of the movement and teetotalism and other social reform causes in later life clearly had a significant effect on his later graphic works. As Vogler has put it, from 1847, the year of his Damascene conversion to temperance at the age of 55, he developed an evangelical preoccupation with the evils of alcohol, and increasingly turned the anarchic power of visual comedy to address what he regarded as this pervasive social wrong. Now, his involvement with the temperance movement from the mid-1840s is traditionally believed to have had a negative and all-consuming effect on his work, which is seen by some as becoming narrow, didactic and dogmatic. However, this is a verdict very much questioned and nuanced by more recent scholars and art historians who emphasize his much earlier interest in the cultures of intoxication, the continued vibrancy of his alcohol-related works, and his sustained interest in a variety of other non-alcoholic subjects. And while, as we'll see, sometimes overtly moralizing, I think it's important at this stage to emphasize that his alcohol-related compositions are always deeply sympathetic. There is overindulgence, frailty, conceit, and self-deception, of course, but there's also resourcefulness, determination, muddling through, verve, humanity, and in many cases, sheer bad luck. So we're now simply going to look at three of my favourite of his intoxicating worlds, one freestanding and two series or progresses, using images, openly licensed images, drawn from the holdings of the Extraordinary Welcome collection, with whom we are, of course, collaborating on the organisation of this workshop. So the first image we're going to look at is the Gin Shop, an etching produced in 1829, so long before Cruikshank's conversion to temperance in the 1840s, and published as part of a series of comic sketches on different subjects within a single book. And I love this image so much that I actually used it as the featured image for this workshop on our website, as you may have noticed. So the Gin Shop imagines the Gin Shop, one of 19th century London's most ubiquitous drinking places, as a macabre and treacherous space of death. The barmaid is a skeleton in disguise. Kill Devil, Deddy's Cordial and Blue Ruin line the room in coffin-shaped receptacles, while the bedraggled family of drinkers stand in a literal gin trap, the central visual pun of the etching. Another skeleton, accessorized with a rattle, spear and hourglass, ominously predicts that they have nearly had their last glass. Now, characteristically, the image contains many textual elements in the form of clever speech bubbles, labels, signs, and other linguistic devices. And as with Peter's cartoons yesterday, there's also anthropomorphism and humanization of inanimate objects, drawing, in this case, on traditions from Victorian children's literature. And interestingly, one of the preparatory sketches that always preceded Cruikshank's finished works survives for the Gin Shop in the holdings of the British Museum. And here it is, we can see him here sort of thinking on paper, as it were, characteristically. We can see the outline of the main design, surrounded by experimental sketches of particular telling details. So the next work we're going to look at is The Progress of Mr. Lambkin, a series of 24 etchings from the bachelor's own book, which Cruikshank self-published in 1844. And this series charts the alcohol-induced downward spiral of the titular Mr. Lambkin, a doomed dandy in pursuit of women and pleasure. So what we have here is a sort of 19th century rake's progress. And I've chosen this one to look at as it's more overtly stylized comic and hopeful than some of Cruikshank's other alcohol-related narrative sequences, and operates in a different, more elevated social milieu, which was actually quite unusual for him. Here we have a London high life rather than London low life. And the etchings in this series chart Lambkin's increasingly excessive drinking, eventual illness, and significantly his ultimate redemption, linking in with Anne-Marie's question yesterday. And I'll move here through the intoxicant-related plates, paraphrasing and elaborating on the printed captions by which they were accompanied. So plate one shows Mr. Lambkin making his toilet to his admiration. Nothing wrong here, no particular cause for alarm, although it does rather indicate someone who is a little bit self-regarding. In plate three, he's enjoying wine with fellow bachelors after what's described as a white bait dinner. Again, sort of normal, sociable drinking and company keeping, lubricated by alcohol, no cause for concern at this point. Alarm bells, however, start ringing in plate 4. After the dinner depicted in the previous plate, Lambkin has become incapacitated. He blames the whitebait, but his condition has clearly been brought on by too much of the grape, and his friends can be seen, who are all smoking cigars, can be seen attempting to revive him with brandy and soda water. Things continue to go awry in plate 5. Lambkin here has got drunk at a society picnic, and while trying to be amusing by dressing himself in women's clothes and parading around with a parasol, he's only succeeded in making himself, as the caption puts it, very ridiculous. He himself has become an embarrassing figure of fun, a sport for all the company, linking in to Anne-Marie's point yesterday. And Lambkin's alcohol-induced social humiliation and disgrace continues into plate 6, when at a party he started to violently dance the polka and upsets a tray of coffee. And whereas in the previous place at the picnic, the onlookers sort of look on with a sort of benign amusement, here the attitude of the spectators is tending more towards shock and consternation. Which I think is significant. And in plate 8, in another significant development, the morning drinking has started. Here, Lambkin quaffs champagne in the carriage as he returns from the Hummums, which was a bathhouse and rumoured brothel in Covent Garden. And by plate 12, things have spun completely out of control. Lambkin's hauled into court and possesses a black eye after getting into a fight that we learn was, of course, alcohol related. In plate 16, the downward spiral continues. Lambkin is here, a drunk Lambkin is here being propped up against his front door while incapacitated by a sympathetic pipe smoking cabman. And by plate 19, Lambkin's life of alcoholic indulgence has caught up with him and completely overwhelmed his physical health. He's depicted incapacitated, unwell in bed, and is undergoing a fashionable water cure. And this is one of 3 separate plates depicting his physical decrepitude. However, as I mentioned at the outset, there is a redemptive narrative arc to this sequence, linking in with Anne-Marie's question yesterday. And by plate 20, Lambkin is literally back on the horse, miraculously restored to health by his water cure. Here he is in plate 21, enjoying not wine, champagne, porter, or brandy, but instead new milk from the cow. And in the final plate, here he is on his wedding day, back to his former glories, triumphant and redivivus. However, as always with Cruikshank, there's a poignant and suggestive sting in the tale. In the caption, Lambkin slurringly proposes a toast, and his hand is reaching for a flute of champagne. So the final work I'm going to look at is The Drunkard's Children, which we also glimpsed briefly in Cynthia's presentation yesterday. And this is the sequel to Cruikshank's much better known temperance series, The Bottle, and was published the following year in 1848. Like the previous work, it's an epic and heartbreaking Hogarthian progress about the evils and dangers of drink across a variety of metropolitan sites and spaces, imbued with a powerful sense of moralistic melodrama. And whereas The Bottle very much focuses on the disintegration of the domestic sphere, The Drunkard's Children is more interesting for our purposes as it charts decline over a more diverse and expansive, even global set of spatial contexts. For me, it also has a much more compelling narrative, is visually more varied and exciting, and as the children are not so much architects of their own fates as from the outset victims of circumstance, they had alcoholic parents, is actually rather more moving. Again, so we'll move through the slides in sequence, and I'll paraphrase and elaborate on the captions. So in plate 1, we are returned to the familiar environment of the gin shop. In a reference to Hogarth's The Harlot's Progress, the daughter depicted here in the middle is flanked by a procuress on the right and a pimp on the left, while the son drinks, and here he is, drinks and smokes with two older men, and a little sort of huddled poor family in the bottom right corner evokes that from the gin shop. We again have a baby, gin being administered to a baby, and looming receptacles for alcohol. This time, barrels are again given ironic names. So sort of recycling and reusing many of the visual motifs from the gin shop, which we sort of looked at earlier, but within an overall sort of more realistic idiom. In the second plate, the son can be seen gambling, here he is in the middle, in another low tavern, with dubious looking individuals in various states of inebriation depicted elsewhere in the image. There's a general sense of disorder and abandon, and again, alcohol-related incapacitation in the bottom left corner. In plate 3, the daughter dances in yet another drinking establishment, while a young man, this is the same figure from the first plate who was on her left, and who's intimated to be her pimp, leeringly smokes and looks on. Again, ironic signs advertise fine lemonade and imperial pop. Here it is, and significantly, there's a sign here saying that no gentlemen are to dance with their hats on, and that no gentlemen are to smoke except at refreshment time. And significantly, like the general principles of Victorian morality, these rules are being openly flouted elsewhere within the image. In the fourth plate, following his committal of a robbery while under the influence of alcohol, a bleary-eyed porter leads police to the son in a threepenny lodging house, and here he is being surprised, presumably in the middle of the night. And incidentally, the porter himself bears more than a passing resemblance to a certain 21st century someone, lending this particular plate a horrible contemporary frisson. In the fifth plate, the siblings have migrated from the bar of the gin shop to that of the Old Bailey, and are both in the dock. In stark contrast to the light and comedic, lightly caricatured style of the Lambkin series, here we have an almost photorealistic depiction of the 19th century courtroom. In plate 6, the son is sentenced to transportation to Australia. And this abject image, the last in which the siblings actually appear together, depicts the moment of their parting. In plate 7, as with Mr. Lambkin in the previous series, drink-related dissipation has completely overtaken the son, although here there's no salvation through water cures. He is actually depicted here just after the moment of death in his prison ship, the Justitia Hulk. Two attendants grimly screaming off his body, while the departing priest has clearly just administered the last rites, and two of the other prisoners on the ship being transported look studiously in the other direction. And in the eighth and final plate, probably Cruikshank's simplest, most nightmarish and most heartrending etching, the daughter commits suicide by jumping from a bridge in the pale moonlight. As well as being destitute and bereaved, she is, according to the caption, gin mad. And her dress and petticoats billowing, it's been noted that she has the appearance of a macabre butterfly or moth against the imposing bulk of the bridge. So as with the bottle, and unlike Lambkin, there's no redemptive arc to this series, no atonement or salvation, only the sweet release of death. And on that cheerful note, I'm going to leave it. Thank you very much.